You know, this was, this place here, someone said you have to talk a little bit, I think you mentioned that, talk a little bit about this place here and what this is. This was actually Brideswell Palace from Henry VIII was located here. Some people might know or not know. It's a long time ago, it was before I was born. But then it became a poorhouse, then it became a hotel. And it was only when Lord Lever bought this site, or he rented it first, in 1925 or so, that he tore it all down and he built this building, which unfortunately he never saw himself because he passed on in 25, and this building was opened in 1930. And to come back to Henry VIII, we are now very fortunate, as you have seen, as you might have seen when you came in, on one of the floors we have the Royal Mail, so we have our royal connection back in an indirect way, and that brings us here. But we're very happy to host this evening, obviously, and food is one of our passions. It's half of our business, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. But the most important thing, I think, is why you're here tonight. You're some tremendous leaders from the Commonwealth countries, and impressive to hear the statistics of the Commonwealth. I just come from a very small country, the Netherlands, and we clearly were not so smart when we expanded our territories and didn't create a Commonwealth of the Netherlands. But probably better, because I would have had too many dinners like you have. But the good thing is you're a tremendous group of leaders, and that is what is the most important thing why you're here this week. And the mission that you have of developing the leaders is probably the most important thing I can talk about. I often say there is two things we're short of in this world. One is trees and one is leaders. And very relevant that you talked that in the concept of cities that you're working on so passionately this week. I was not aware of how intense your program is, and that you're really spending day and night for 6 days talking about it. So we are probably not only creating great leaders this week, but also highly knowledgeable groups about the in and outs of what smart cities look like. And I hope that you still stay connected to use that knowledge, because we have a tremendous challenge ahead. This world I often describe as a VUCA world. It's actually a term that came from the US War Academy in Carlisle, which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that's probably a fairly accurate description of the time we live. Everybody will say it's never an easy time, and I would agree with that. But I've thought about it many times, and I think what is happening in these 10, 15 years that we are now here, it's obviously tremendously exciting. But there are some forces coming together that have never come together before. And as they come together at the same time, we're starting to wrestle with some of them. One of these forces is the tremendous shift we've seen with an enormous speed to the world moving east and south. This is what we were talking about Singapore, where you have the Lee Kuan Yew School of Management, and one of the people that teaches there is Kishore Mahbubani, and he wrote this book of what he calls the New Asian Hemisphere. But we've seen a tremendous shift, and that shift has been obviously very good. If the world is more balanced, more people participating is a very positive thing. But at the same time, as we were talking, it has also created a vacuum in global governance. There's a plus and a minus to that. All of the institutions with which we were governing this world that we deal with were basically from 1948, from the Bretton Woods type things. I'm talking about the IMF, the World Banks, and the WTO, and many of the other ones. And frankly, they're not made to operate at a maximum potential, if I may say, in this current economic environment. The second trend that we see is what I would call perhaps the end of the era of abundance. We have the positive again, is we have created more people, we have lifted more people out of poverty than at any time in history. In fact, 500 million people in the last 30 to 40 years alone. In fact, one of the Millennium Development Goals that we set in the year 2000, Kofi Annan, at that time Secretary General, set the goal of halving the number of people living in poverty. So it was a very stretched goal in 2000. Defined as people was earning $1.25 a day or less. We've actually achieved that objective. We should be proud of that. China has been a big contributor, but many other countries actually. Enormous wealth creation, but at the same time, that has put an enormous demand on the world's resources. These issues that we are now talking of, water scarcity, or food security issues, or climate change, were not even on people's radar screens in the year 2000. The end of the era of abundance. We are actually using more resources than this world can replenish. We're borrowing definitely from our future children. John Rockström, who runs the Resilience Institute in Stockholm, has quantified these 9 planetary boundaries, and 3 of them, which he says nitrogen levels, climate change, obviously, and biodiversity, are what he would describe already well beyond the minimal levels. Now, the scary thing of this is that the top 1.5 billion people in this world use about 75% of the world's resources. And the bottom 5.5, whatever is left, aspire to live like them. The numbers don't add up. And this is before another 3, some people would argue potentially 4 billion people might come to this wonderful world. The third trend, which is also coming at the same time, and we were talking that as well at the table, is the enormous digitization of society. Has made it more transparent. Everybody has a voice. Everybody can participate, has made us more connected, has brought technologies and qualities of life to us that we could not have imagined before. And that's a very plus. But it has also created a different society of the included and the non-included. If you are not technology literate right now, even in the US, where 70 million people live below the poverty line, it's worse probably than at any time in their history in terms of numbers. And there's a clear divide of who's included in technology, who's not included in technology. The job destruction that is coming up in the future is going to be an enormous challenge. And what this has done in this society is that you see a society now where wealth is enormously concentrated. We all know this Oxfam study that in 2016, 1% of the richest people in this world will have the same net wealth as the bottom 50% of this wealth. So wealth has become enormously concentrated, but in fact the power, if you call that the voice, has become very dispersed. Every consumer now has a voice, and they're using that increasingly so to try to drive changes. I would argue even that most of the changes that we see in this world of substance are coming from people, especially the young, getting together and driving these changes, and not anymore from governments as what we were used to. Since you're talking about cities, I could not hesitate to tell you about, to start with Dickens' book of obviously 1850s, when Dickens wrote his book about the tale of two cities. At that time he was talking about London and Paris, but his first lines in the book was, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I think that is actually what we're facing. It's the best of times. Never have opportunities been so enormous, never have life been so good for many of us, but it's also the worst of times. This is still a world where and I think the economic crisis, if I may say, in 2007, 2008, brought to life that our economic system has indeed created an enormous amount of wealth, but it is also fair to say that had come at an enormous price. The enormous levels of private debt and public debt, the enormous overconsumption I just talked about, and frankly leaving too many people behind. So a system that is not in equilibrium, where too many people are behind or not participating, ultimately will rebel against itself. And that is what you see happening as we stand here and talk. So it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And what we now need, and why it's so important to have the leaders like yourselves here, is we need to be sure that we get the best of times for everybody. And I think that is just our simple mission. If you ask the people, what purpose do you want to have in life, and how do you want to live your life when it's over and be remembered for, it is probably making a positive impact, leaving the place a little bit better than you found it. And the best way to do that is obviously to unselfishly work on the common good, the interest of others. I think many people will tell you that if you have your philosophy of giving to others, you actually end up receiving more. The job of CEO that I do, I've always said to people, is probably the easiest job that exists in this company. It might sound funny, and some people don't believe me when I say that, but the only thing I have to do is be sure that all the others that work in this company are successful, and they are doing a marvelous job, and then I stand here and recount their stories and try to share them with many others. But by being able to invest in others, you also will see that others ultimately invest in you, and that is probably one of the most important leadership lessons to talk about. The cities is a very important thing for the same reason of the statistics that have been mentioned, and I don't want to mention too many more, but all the economic growth and all the expansions is happening actually around the cities. Right now 55% of the world population lives in cities. By the way, that in 1950 that was about 30%. It's going to be 70%, and in my opinion there is no reason why that cannot grow higher. 70% of the GDP is in cities, and these numbers are just growing up. It's interesting, as a company like Unilever, we don't look anymore as much at country plans, because it becomes sometimes very difficult to deal with countries. we actually find that we can do much better when we deal with mayors of cities. And if you take the significant cities in the world and you add them all up, you probably come to the same numbers in our business, that you talk 60-70% in our business. So when we look, for example, at the Philippines, what can we do in Jakarta? As a visit where you normally would see the president, Aquino in this case, you'd probably see the mayor of the city before you do anything else. Because it's with him that you can talk about recycling systems or cleaning up the city and getting real action. With governments, it becomes increasingly more difficult to do that. It's not surprising when we were at the World Economic Forum this year again in January in Davos, that with the International Business Council that I happen to be part of, we invited all the mayors of the major cities. We didn't invite the heads of states. And that meeting was very constructive. We talked about youth unemployment. How can we tackle that? How can we tackle it in the cities, and what can we do together? And as a result, we got, just out of a day, spending a day together, we got 30 or 40 projects that I'm sure some of them will come to fruition and others will provide learnings. The speed with which urbanization happens is frightening. In fact, you have 1.4 million people moving to cities every week. That is the size of a city like Stockholm every week. A city like London, I don't know how we define London, it's a little bit difficult, and what Boris told you yesterday, but that's about the city of London every 6 or 7 weeks if you look at that. And look at the footprint that is happening, that comes out of that. The way that we build cities is still very much in the urban sprawl. In fact, if you look at the global, the land area that is being used, that's about tripled between the year 2000 and if you do this projection to 2030. And in terms of speed of that, means the additional land use of about the size of Manhattan every day that you need to get more cities. And the biggest issue that we face, I think, is this urban sprawl, which makes these cities actually extremely inefficient and unsustainable. If you think we have issues now, and you believe these statistics I'm just sharing with you, which are basically a fact, which is what is happening, then the numbers don't add up anymore. And it's actually the way we design these cities and the way that these cities are developing are getting us to a point that our economic system doesn't function anymore either. So as you attack the issue of smart cities, which is the topic of your week here, you're actually attacking the issue, the fundamental issue of how society should function. The fundamental issue, if we ever arrive at a time that we can irreversibly eradicate poverty in a more sustainable and equitable way. If the answers to these questions are not done via the solutions of the cities, I don't think we will get there. You take the US as an example, which we studied as part of another project I was involved in, where you have urban sprawl in cities like Atlanta, which are fundamentally different than, let's say, a city of Barcelona. Both about the same number of inhabitants, but the density is a factor 10 different. The carbon footprint is a factor 100 different. The US, we reckon, loses every year about $500 billion on inefficiencies in cities. These inefficiencies are measured in loss of productivity, like we see in all of our daily lives if we drive through cities and are in traffic jams. The extra cost you need to put in infrastructures. The effects on the climate itself. In many of the 30 most polluted cities in the world now, 15 of them are in India, by the way, but we reckon that in China, 650,000 lives are lost just because of the pollution in the cities itself. So the cost of not designing it right is horrendous for society. And it actually becomes the cost of society nearly, as cities represent basically what the economy is all about. I just came back 2 or 3 weeks ago from Sharm el-Sheikh. I thought it would be a nice place to go on holiday, but we unfortunately were only there for the weekend for the Economic Development Conference of Egypt. 40% of the Arab community is actually lives in Egypt. So if we want ever to have peace in that region, the best investment we can make right now is to support Egypt and make the Egyptian economy stronger. And I was glad to see that most countries were there, including the UK and many others. And they're building a new capital. They've just decided to build this capital city between Cairo and the Suez Canal, which is going to be a city that is planned for 5 million people and planned sustainably. It's an enormous project. But we will not be able to lift Egypt out of poverty in a sustainable way. We will not be able to get peace in the Arab world as a result of that if we don't design this properly. So the issue is not just a new city because we have more population. The issue is the right to live by virtue of how you build your new city. It's interesting because I was a few weeks before in India for the TERI conference on sustainable living, and actually trying to get the Indians to submit their targets for the climate COP21, which is going to be held in Paris in December. And Modi, obviously Prime Minister Modi, has started his initiative of 100 smart cities. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. But in this initiative of 100 smart cities, where he's already spending $1.5 billion this year alone, it is important that the definition of what this smart city looks like is well understood, because many in India, even in the governments, think it's about, how do we have a little bit less slums than we have now, or how do we get a little bit more cars than we otherwise could afford. And the way that these cities are developed, this is not exactly something that, in my opinion, is sustainable. And to explain to them that 15 of the 30 most polluted cities in the world are in India. Delhi, by the way, is the most polluted city. I'm wearing contact lenses myself, but I couldn't go outside, to be honest. Nor would have been any sense to go outside because you couldn't see the other side of the street anyway. But if these issues are not attacked, it won't work. I saw a study that my wife gave me in one of the articles that she read about YouGov, where they asked people about the quality of life, and very quickly you now see that it's just not about just having the job or having a certain income anymore. It's about quality of life, the schooling, the crime, and these are all the things that you need to take into account when you talk about smart cities. I personally think that the smartest cities are probably the ones that first figure out how to be really smart before they figure out how to leverage technology, because then you put the human being in the center of all the things you develop. So for me, the definition is more, as I've mentioned to you, is how do you make it livable and how do you make it sustainable? And one of the things that I'm very passionate about this year is the Sustainable Development Goals that we need to conclude in September in the UN. I had the fortune to be a member of the high-level panel, with one of the co-chairs was David Cameron, and we have the COP21 in Paris. Now, it's not surprising that the same year, 2015, we need to agree on the Sustainable Development Goals, which fortunately now everybody talks Sustainable Development Goals, not just Millennium Development Goals or some other things. And we have to agree on the COP21, which is the climate change agreements, because obviously they are two sides of the same coin. And it's not surprising. The Royal Highness was just in the Philippines, we were talking about it. In climate change, it's increasingly affecting all parts of the world. I came from the US last week, where Jerry Brown cut water use in California by 30%. A few weeks ago, I was in Brazil, where the water reservoirs are at 10-20% of its capacity, where energy has to be cut off. Energy prices have gone up already 20% or 30%. A city like Rio with 11 million, or Sao Paulo with 11 million people, depends totally on hydroelectricity. So people are seeing the cost of climate change coming in, but unfortunately it's the poor that suffer. When Hurricane Sandy hit the east coast of the United States, I have two of my sons living in New York. They had jokes because they had to walk 50 stairs. They had never done that in their lives. They all of a sudden felt a little fitter. They couldn't watch television, but they finally discovered that they had girlfriends. So life was good, life was good. But the people in Haiti, they were pushed back by another 2 or 3 years. Obviously, many more lives lost. So when you talk these major issues of climate change, and you come back to cities again, 70% of the carbon emission is now in cities. President Calderon was asked to chair a committee which is called the New Climate Economy Committee, which we deliberately created. Nick Stern on there from the UK. We deliberately created this with Nobel Prize winners and others just before the climate negotiations, because this firm belief has crept into politicians and many others in the world that climate change is a nuisance because it takes the attention away from creating jobs and growing the economy. And what this report was trying to prove, and in fact firmly is proving, that if we don't tackle climate change, we don't have the growth, we don't create the jobs. It's not either or, it is a precondition for a successful, more sustainable growth. And not surprisingly in that report, there are only 3 areas that are being discussed that basically have all the answers. And by the way, you don't need to send anybody to Mars to find the answers, nor do you need more PhDs to find the answers. What you need is human willpower to behave like adults, to sit together, to work in the interest of the common good to solve that. And I give you some examples of that in a minute. But there are only 3 areas that you need to focus on. One is cities. I've talked about that. 70% carbon impact globally. So how do you build these cities efficiently? The other one is land use. Deforestation is a big issue in this world. A lot of it driven by food. That's why we, as a company, or myself personally, have to take responsibility to help find these solutions. And the last one is obviously energy itself. How can we basically get to a more sustainable form of energy and obsolete some of the other ones, especially coal. So these 3 things can give us the answer if we focus on that. I talked about the poorest. Let me see if there are other... talked about the high-level panel. Now, it's not surprising that also when we worked on the high-level panel to submit the goals to the Secretary General as a draft outline of what this report could be for the Sustainable Development Goals, it was not surprising again that we put the cities in there. One of our members on the panel was in fact the mayor of Istanbul, which is Kadir Topbaş. He's still the mayor of Istanbul, and he was adamant to say we cannot solve all these things unless we put cities in there at the center of this sustainable development. And that is what we did, and I think it came through there also fairly clearly. So 2015 is a very important year for all of us, and that is why we need more leaders than ever. Not only to solve these things, but how we solve these things. At Unilever, we decided a long time ago that business needed to be done differently. It's the same reason why we created the B team. There is a plan B, there is an alternative for the way things are being done. I've always said, because I don't want to create confusion, I think capitalism is fairly good. Is Winston Churchill in this country, if I may quote him, he said that democracy is the worst form of governance except for all the other ones invented. And as usual, Winston Churchill was right. But the same can be said for capitalism. It's the worst form of running these economies, except for all the other ones being invented. But what is also clear is that if we don't evolve it and start to adapt it to the needs of tomorrow, it will ultimately be rejected. And you already see that happening. The volatility in stock prices of companies, the speed with which companies go out of business, the way that consumers reject these companies. And trust is obviously a big element of that, and the lack of trust is obviously a big cause of that. It's probably higher than it has ever been in the history of mankind. So just like Franklin Roosevelt did with the New Deal in the US, we have to evolve this capitalism. In Unilever, we created the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. Now, it's nothing else than saying, how can we have a positive impact on society? We want to grow our business. We can easily double our business, and we're well on our way to do that, because of the opportunity of lifting so many people still out of poverty. But we said, why don't we grow by totally decoupling our growth from environmental impact and at the same time improving our social impact? Now, what made our model different from many other companies that stay in the CSR space, which I don't want to belittle nor criticize, but we said we're going to take responsibilities of the total value chain from farm to fork. So if you're in the food business, you take responsibility for sustainable agriculture, you take responsibility for creating jobs with smallholder farmers in an equitable way, but you also take responsibility to ensure that we don't have these issues, for example, of deforestation. Deforestation, just as a side comment, is about 17% of global warming. And 70% of deforestation is actually the enormous demand for food that causes that. So you need to take that responsibility. If you do, I think you'll be a positive contributor to society. You actually go back to the roots of why companies were invented. Nobody can tell me that companies were invented for their shareholders, but yet it looks like it in today's world. Under this enormous pressure that we live on immediate returns and satisfactions of the short-termism of the financial market is really destroying the model of creating these sustainable economies that we all need to give everybody an opportunity to have a decent life. So short-termism is an issue that we need to attack. For that reason, in Unilever, we stopped doing quarterly reporting, we stopped giving guidance, we changed compensation systems for the long term, so that our people could also think for the longer term. And that's a very important driver, I think, for where we want to be. Our Unilever Sustainable Living Plan is working for us. The main reason it's working for us is that our brands are the best manifestation of doing that. You know some of the people here in your countries. I'll try to find some of the brands that we sell in all of your countries. But one of our biggest brands is, for example, Domestos, which is a toilet bowl cleaner. And people might say, isn't its goal to sell more toilet bowl cleaning and products and make more profits? But the mission of Domestos for us is to end the issue of open defecation when you still have 1.5 billion people, with all the issues that it gives, by the way, not having access to a toilet. One of our fastest growing brands is Lifebuoy. You might say that's selling bar soap for people to wash their hands. No, for us it's really to help everybody reach the age of 5. This is still a world where 2 million children don't make it to the age of 5 for infectious diseases like pneumonia or diarrhea, that you could just solve with the issue of washing your hands for probably the lowest cost to society that has ever been invented. And by the way, the reason that Lord Lever started his company, he created the brand Lifebuoy, like he created the brand Sunlight in Victorian Britain, only for one reason. The reason was that the problems of hygiene were so high in Victorian Britain that 1 out of 2 babies didn't make it either past year 1. He found a real need in society. He didn't do it for his quarterly shareholders, by the way, either, as a side comment. So we are very excited with the brands we use to make that vision come alive. And what we have seen is, most places we end up being the preferred employer. We are the number 3 company that is most looked up on LinkedIn after Apple and Google, which is totally bizarre because we are not a brand like Apple and Google. And I have to say, I've tried to explain it many times now to my 87-year-old mother, and she doesn't get it either. And all I can tell her is I don't get it either. But there is something there about young people that they want to, like bears to the honey or honey to the bees or whatever you call it in the UK. They want to work for companies that make a difference. And when you hear that not many of the generation Y or Z wants to work for multinationals anymore, we actually find the opposite. We also find suppliers working with us in a completely different way. And obviously, society at large is rewarding us as well. I think that's the only way, by the way, longer term, that I can be reassured that we have a success. Now, the issue that we have is that we know what we have to do. Anytime we have a discussion about that, it's very quick that we reach agreements. Of course, we need to solve that. I've never met a CEO who wants more unemployment, more pollution, or more people lacking food security. Obviously, everybody wants to solve it. Why doesn't it happen then? Why doesn't it happen? We know the answers. And we know actually that the cost of not acting is starting to become higher than the cost of acting. So that's why there's an enormous incentive to get going. And the only answer is not technology, is not know-how. We have all these things, and obviously we can use these things. The only answer is human willpower. And if it's human willpower, at the end of the day, it's leadership. It's not different from the leadership of Rosa Parks, who refused to step off her seat on the bus in Alabama and change the face of racial segregation in the US. It's not different of the leadership of Mandela in Africa when he said we're going to draw a line through the word apartheid. And the list goes on. It is people that make the difference. It's people like all of you, in this case in the Commonwealth, that can say we can do something about it. And you have to. We created this program here for leaders for 2020 onwards, because the best thing I can do is to be sure that we have better and bigger leaders than ourselves, and that our company has better and bigger values than when we founded. To reassure that our company has a longer life. We created a major training center, we call it the Hardware in Singapore, because a lot of our recruiting will be done in that part of the world, as you can imagine, because the growth is there as well. We spent a lot of time thinking about, we call it Unilever 2020, but what does leadership look like in 2020 and beyond? And the things we are looking for as major words, but you have to make them come alive, is obviously authentic leadership. I always think first and foremost, to be a great leader, you need to be a human being. But this authenticity is enormous. You know with whom you go to the bar. You know with whom you have in your families and who your friends are. It is people that are true to themselves. Obviously understand their strengths and weaknesses as well. But this authenticity that comes with transparency, that is the basis for trust, is enormously important. Just like the fastest growing brands in this world are the authentic brands that you can relate to. that are the real brands that are your friends. Often because you know the farmer, or you know what has happened with the products. They don't have labels with words on it you can't pronounce. So authenticity is one of the most important things. Adaptability is another one. We are going to live in this VUCA world for a long time to come. It's just too interdependent what we have created to even see the effects. The financial market is the epitome of that, but we just don't know anymore how any of these economic theories that we've developed can work in this world that we have created. So this volatility, because of this interdependence, is going to be more. You need to be very adaptable as the second one. The third one is resilience. This is a world where personal resilience, company resilience is going down. Company lifetimes are less, but people's lifetimes are actually less as well. Not in age that we live, but the number of people that hook off, the stress, the suicides are enormous. In fact, in a recent study, only 13% of the people are engaged to go to work. 87% is basically hooked off, doing the thing for their salaries. On a global basis that is, but it's not that different in each of the individual countries. We need to build up more resilience, including human and mental resilience, and leaders have that. Obviously, there's always been the results-focused and driving to output. But then the last one I wanted to mention very briefly is to be a systemic thinker. You have to be able to take this complexity of the world as tomorrow or today's leaders and be able to synthesize that in some simple action and drive it to conclusion. I give you the example of food security once more, where people will say, oh, it's not that easy. You want to solve food security, but then you get into the issues of water. Well, you want to solve water, you get to the issue of energy. And sometimes it feels like this little balloon. You know, we've all done this game. You squeeze the balloon, but then it pops up somewhere else. And you cannot get your hands around it. You cannot solve it. So you need leaders that are able to take these complexities and drive them into simplicity and then, more importantly, in action. I always mention 4 simple leadership skills that at least have worked for myself. The first one is a high level of awareness. If you as leaders are not aware of the things that go on around you, how can you actively participate, for example? But then the second thing I've talked about before is a high level of engagement. Awareness without engagement doesn't lead to anything. And then in this world, more than ever, I think we have discovered that what we need is people that really care, that operate with a certain level of humanity and humility, which is what I would leave you with as the last skills. I don't want to spend too much more time, but I found we have a wonderful group of people here from across the world, and one of the Commonwealth countries is obviously Kenya, which is very much on our hearts and minds right now, to be sure that we get there as well, a longer lasting peace. And you had a wonderful Nobel laureate, which was Wangari Maathai. And actually is a very interesting one, because she was creating also the concept of the green belts, which we now take for common in many of the cities. London has had that a long time, but she was an advocate on that. And she said very simply, when she accepted her Nobel Prize, she said, in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called upon to a new level of consciousness to reach a higher moral ground. I could not agree more with her, and I can only conclude the time is now. I want to just leave one final thought, and that is, to stand here, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to address you as well. But it shouldn't be me. It should be the one that didn't make it past the age of 5. It should be the child that should talk here. It should be the farmer, often stunted or undernutritioned himself because he doesn't have an income. It should be the enormous growing group of youth and unemployed that are desperately crying to be included in society. That's why we're standing here. So if you belong to these 2% of the world population, which you do, that are educated, that can do what they want, that can work for companies that they want, probably be free to move to the countries you want to move to. At least put yourselves to the service of the other 98%. Thank you very much.